George Banks was walking through the streets of Ipswich, all will to live now absent from his soul. He looked at the rows of unfinished buildings stretching into the distance, briefly thinking of his thatched cottage and realising he would never see it again. His fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. As soon as he got to his yacht, he would do it. He had no other choice. He looked around at the colourful shop displays, whole worlds of unaffordable items gleaming back at him from halogen-lit glass. He felt himself begin to shake. He couldn't be poor again. He'd never get another job at his age. He knew that. He felt himself glide past a bright maze of iron railings toward the outdoor market, where pensioners ate pasties from greasy paper packets, and oceans of jeans and white trainers moved beneath the canopies of the stalls. Above it all, the sky was a pure sheet of white cast low over the blue and red striped tarpaulins. He stared into its stillness until he was dizzy. He felt journey-bound for that blank and insubstantial mist above, closer in kind to those senseless, drifting clouds than the babbling crowds that moved around him now. He was puzzled by everything human beings stood for. He gazed ahead, waiting for some moment of clarity to hit, some rush of life-giving perspective that would make his plan seem ridiculous, but nothing came. Fear clutched his ribcage, crippling his innards. He felt as though he were a guardian angel made flesh, charged with the task of overseeing its own death. He was a visitor in these parts now, bound for a land of infinite blackness. His yacht waited ahead, bobbing among 100 others, ready to ferry him into the abyss. The shudder of dread in his chest continued as he looked up at the buildings, the Gothic cranes, abandoned scaffolds and broken windows looming above him, and a long scream sounded in his mind. If only he wasn't absolutely certain of what would happen if he broke the news of his redundancy to his family. The sneers, the tantrums, the panic. If only he'd signed up for a council house instead of taking out an enormous mortgage on that tumble-down country cottage. If only his hermit sons had got jobs and houses and lives of their own instead of living at home with him well into their 30s. If only he could call his wife right now and have her sound happy to hear from him. If any one of these wishes could come true, he might change his mind. But that wasn't how life worked. He turned the corner and saw his reflection pace across the glossy black glass of the Willis building. The old civil hall where he'd been married was reflected in its windows, a spectre of his past towering behind him in the vast, shining panes. He didn't look at it directly, like a superstitious peasant avoiding a hex, and he sped up his pace until he reached Princes Street. It hadn't changed since they moved out, abandoned shops painted in predictable shades of white, station green and navy, all of them boarded up or for sale. He crossed the road, walking on the faint shadow a black crane cast over the tarmac. He passed the Ladbrokes building, several old cars parked at careless angles outside its curved facade. His lips pursed together at the memory of this place. £3,000 lost in a single bet. He'd been proud of that fact until recently. No wonder the lot of them hated his guts. As he walked out the tension in his legs, his eyes wandered up the side of a derelict building, which rippled with the same green netting that was stretched from scaffold to scaffold around the town. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was really seeing things. Iron poles jutted out from the walls, symmetrical nests of metal, and a little higher up a welder seemed to strike a giant sparkler alight. He marvelled at his powers of observation, still sharp after 65 years. He was a man of vision, or at least he had been once. He could have been an architect, a pilot, anything he liked if he had his time again. He was wasted on her, on all of them, on that back-breaking labour, the snakes he worked with. All at once a vicious flame ignited inside him. He was seized with the urge to smash his fist through the first car window he walked past. He was sure that he could do it without the slightest discomfort, as hard and dead as he felt inside. His anger was the opposite of his soul, exerting an unholy pressure upon his being that could only be relieved through an act of extreme violence. The rage inside had become a burning demon, straining to break through the confines of his body, years of frustration and hopelessness reducing his soul to a hollow shell, filled with the insane urge to split through his skin and tear the world to shards. He put his hand to his neck and longed to feel the snugness of the rope beneath his fingers. He stood up and broke into a run then, pains, cruel nails sinking deep into his flesh before raking dreadfully downwards. He ran as fast as he could, dwarfed by the vast black-roofed flats with their smashed windows, and by the time he reached the painted anchor of the marina, the pain was intolerable. He tried to compose himself, to watch the scenery of the dock serenely. If only he could become his eyes for a moment, to be only what he saw. Perhaps he could perform this final task like a man, calm, dignified, and without emotion. Absolute peace governed this place, blue and white boats standing on ceremony as he passed, their rows of sails fluttering like celebratory flags, and an air of slow-motion movement touched everything around him, from the birds to the waves to the sailors themselves. He hesitated a moment before stepping onto the boardwalk, surveying the rows of gently bobbing yachts. Silver stacks of high-rise flats stood to attention in the distance, lined up in neat rows with unblinking windows. Finally, he saw his yacht. The glossy black nubs of bollards he used to polish, the white ropes which secured it to the deck. They were pulled so tightly today that the air seemed to cut itself and hissed as it passed by them. He'd loved the simple elegance of this marina as a young man with nothing to his name, dreaming of the many freedoms wealth may one day bring him. Now, the house bought, the boat paid for, the family created, and the debts unpayable, he finally understood that death was the only freedom he could afford. He stared past the covered hulls and tarpaulins in their sombre blues and maroons, scanning an imaginary tide line behind them and letting his eyes glide to the edge of an invisible beach. His eyes were all he was. Time to go. He wiped his sweating palms and held onto the rigging of his boat, trying to hoist himself up. His knees gave way, and he clung to the rope for a few moments before the strength left his arms entirely. The next enemy was his hands, joints locking, fingers unable to close on the cold steel. He tried to take a deep breath, but just the thought of breathing was enough to set him panting in shallow, rapid gasps. His neck began to itch. The moment he got into the boat, he would have to do it. He let out a murmur and painfully lowered his body onto the deck, pressing his cheek against the wet wood, tracing the pattern of the wood grain with tingling fingertips. His eyes settled on the dark, shining line of water beneath the boards, and the boat and the boardwalk rocked sickeningly, gulls squealing and hopping about in writhing white piles of feathers. He closed his eyes through warm lines of tears and clambered on board in a few laborious movements, adrenaline powering him forward, all thoughts now absent from his mind. He was nothing but a pair of eyes, a robot with a single task. At one time he would have taken in every detail of the boat, noting the rich green curtains that veiled the small windows, the state of the hob, the amount of storage space, the radio, the condition of the chemical toilet. Instead, he stumbled about the hull, barely cognizant of the shapes and smells around him, like a toddler left in a room for a moment, mutely coming to terms with being alive with the first stirrings of its consciousness. He made a few confused steps forwards until he reached the fold-out table, the low ceilings and wooden compartments looming around him in dull wooden masses as the boat gently rocked. The rope. He opened his briefcase, took out the neatly tied coil of rope and placed it on the table. Next came his diary, which he opened at the page of the suicide note. He tore it out, weighing it down with one of the sherry glasses from the tiny onboard sink. He suddenly wished for whiskey, pacing up and down the galley a few times, clutching the coil of rope and muttering to himself. He was dripping with sweat. He placed his feet on the steps leading up to the deck and moved forward. Out in the open air, he gently edged toward the very front of the bow, securing the tail of the rope to the steel railing with an expertly tied anchor bend knot. In a sudden moment of clarity, he gasped like a drowned man resurfacing. Dropping the noose, he ran back inside the cabin, tore the note into pieces, then opened up the notebook at a random page. "This ought to do it," he wrote in a large, trembling scrawl. He put a finger to each temple and closed his eyes. Now. He felt himself move toward the shock of white light, its luminescence drawing him up the stairs and toward the sky. He didn't look at the clouds, nor did he notice the water or think of his wife or cry. 2 knees bent to the deck, and 2 hands took the rope. There was no sound as he dropped the noose over his head. No voice sounded from beneath the tightened knot. All was still. A smile spread across his face as his feet took their final step across the deck. The air rose, the rope stiffened. and the thing that had once been George Banks dissolved into a rush of dark, burning static.